Hello, and a very warm welcome to all of you to this event in the first Kolkata chapter, spot first Kolkata chapter of CANTO 2023. My name is Avik Chanda. I'm the festival director, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce the two absolutely spectacular panelist speakers for this event, Rohan Chhetri and Souradeep Roy. Quick round of introductions, if I may. Rohan Chhetri is a writer and translator. He's the author of Slow Startle, which won the Emerging Poets Prize back in 2015, and his more recent collection is called Lost, Hurt, or in Transit, Beautiful, which of course is the title of this session. He has also co-edited, together with Kazim Ali, who happens to be part of the Canto Festival, he's co-edited Srila Ray on the life and work of an American master. Rohan is a recipient of a 2021 PEN Haim Grant for translation. His own poems have appeared widely, including in Review Europe, Agni, the Paris Review, and his poems have also been translated into multiple languages, including French and Greek. And today he's going to be joined in conversation by Souradeep Roy, who is a translator, poet, and a performer who spends his time or divides his time between London and Delhi. Souradeep has worked as part of the editorial collective of the Indian Writers Forum, and his own poems have appeared in Fulcrum, the Quarterly Literary Review India, Muse India, Aina Nagar, and The Missing Slate. Currently, Souradeep is pursuing a PhD on the history of the Bengali theatre movement at Queen Mary, University of London. Souradeep and Rohan, over to you, and a very warm welcome again. Thanks.
Thank you, Avik.
Thanks very much. Hi, Rohan. How are
Hi,
you?
Souradeep. It's wonderful to meet you here like this.
Yeah, great to converse in this form.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking of starting off by talking a little bit about one particular poem from your first collection.
Yeah.
Slow Startle, and the rest of the questions will mostly be from your second collection. But the first poem in Slow Startle, I remember, I think the book came out in 2016.
Yeah, it came out in 2016. Yeah, I think. Yeah.
And from what I recall, like in the around 2005 to 2010, and then probably and then further on 2015 is when the book comes out. But probably you were writing in those years initially, and that poem sort of is an ode to the kind of lyric that I think all of us were trying to write at that particular point of time, and where essentially it's almost like a thriller, but not a thriller, where the whole setup is towards that final line.
Exactly.
It has to be the most spectacular line in the poem, and I felt sort of vague sort of echoes of that in the second collection for only one poem really, New Delhi in Winter. And it's not a coincidence that both the poems really are situated and talking about Delhi as a landscape.
In the NCR
region. Yeah, in the NCR, yeah. Not just like a physical landscape, but also I think like an interior landscape of your own. Could you tell me a little bit about those early years of writing and like the lyric that came out of those early years?
Yeah.
I felt like finds a kind of culmination in this particular poem, New Delhi in Winter.
Yeah, I mean, you reminded me of this, and I really am looking at it. There was that whole, impetus towards ending this, like giving this like spectacular, explosive ending, right? Which I tried to subvert a lot in my second collection, with the open, and now I've completely lost that, now when I sort of am writing towards it. But yeah, I remember Vivek Narayanan just looking at that and saying this poem, he was somewhere else at that time. I think he was already in the US or living somewhere else. And he was like, this poem is about Gurgaon, isn't it? And I was like, well, yeah, how do you know? It's like the pigs, the pigs just gave it away. But Yeah, I was like everyone else. Like, I did my master's and I thought, okay, I'm not going to go to academia for a bit. So I went into, publishing, and I worked for about 6 months without pay on an internship at Hachette. And I was living in Gurgaon in this paying guest, and it was dismal, right? I was getting depressed, and it was a very, very depressive landscape. I've got physically depressed, and like I had stomach aches every morning. It was a very, very strange, dismal setting. And that poem literally sort of came out of that, about being, in winter in Gurgaon, in a village next to the publishing house Hachette at that point in time, and there was nothing there. So it really sort of came out of there. And I was in this long distance relationship with someone from Bombay who had gone to Germany, and it was this whole thing. So the poem really came out of that, looking at the landscape of that, the immediate landscape, and the kind of the move was always to kind of refine the landscape, very Transformer like, but also sort of begin with the immediate and sort of try to take it somewhere else. I think that was the mode that I was working with for a long, long time. I was really a big sort of proponent of clear language, and kind of the language not being a hindrance as such. I had a very different methodology, very different idea of what a poem should be, which is very different now in that sense. I problematize language a lot. Language itself becomes the not a means to an end, but like an end in itself. As you can see by the end of my second book, that it's so much of it is just lyric containers, sound vessels, right? Or grief sounds in that way. So yeah, I think that's how the evolution of my work has come about in that way. And definitely, there was a great connection that you made. New Delhi in Winter also does something similar. It has that similar elegiac sort of feel to it. Has that kind of lost love theme to it, and that it really brings those two poems together. Thanks for finding that lineage there. A lot of room to not be just like one thing in that book. I don't know if that answers your question
No, it
properly.
does. No, it does. And
Mhm.
coming to the sort of more choral
Yeah.
quality of the book, just the first line um, in King's Feedery, and I'll just read these out. Um, After the rape and the bloodbath, the savage king and his men retired to a long shed built in an open field by a thin river, fashioned for this lull in the pillaging so the horses could rest. Just this sentence almost contains within itself a whole life world, and
Mm-hmm.
and you begin with the life world. You begin with what has come before.
Yeah.
It's not what you're seeing. It's not the here. It's not the
Yeah.
landscape. It's not anything from your surrounding, but really not something that only you have inherited, but the
Yeah.
entire eastern Himalayas and the place that you want to draw from has
Yeah.
inherited. So why, and also the moving away from the I to say for instance the figure of the they, death takes in threes, they said.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're clearly now taking from a different, you're starting from a different register.
Yeah. Yeah.
And okay, let's just discuss this register first, and then I'll come back to another question which is related. But this is a fairly important shift, I feel, in terms
Mm.
from your first collection to the second one. Was this conscious, and how did this come about?
Yeah, it was. Thank you for that really, really perceptive question. Obviously, it was very, very conscious in the way. Uh, the basic concern was looking at home in a new way, standing, in the tea plantations, in the tea gardens, and kind of thinking like, there was, in the sense, like feeling that kind of what Adam Zagajewski says, that kind of histories hot breath, in the sense. So it was really standing there and thinking about the town, about the kind of the legacy of colonialism, which is so heavy in the tea gardens. And suddenly, like, I mean, it was always there in the first book, very much in the background, but suddenly being hyper aware of that, I think I came across a couple of memoirs from one of the last planters who lived in my hometown, one of the last British planters. I came by chance across a biography which mentions, the last years of the Britishers still sort of being the planters there and everything, and that kind of the tiger hunting and all of that stuff kind of really took me to a different kind of timeline. And I started doing some research about the area, like where I lived, the border town to India and Bhutan in Bengal was a kind of a no man's land. So it was part of Bhutan for a while, and there were raids that were happening by the Bhutanese kings where they would come and loot. And then, the indigenous people living there talked to the British, and the Britishers kind of, there was a cessation of land because there was too much violence happening. So, and then the land was taken over by the British. So there's this long history of that, and that's what the first few lines sort of gets at, the savagery of that at that point in time. And I think that really that it really takes you to a different place. And I wanted to sort of start there, to sort of begin from the beginning in a way. And above all, I think the book takes a lot more is a lot more aware of the legacy of colonialism and neocolonialism and subsequently extractive colonialism that has been going on in that land, in that particular area of the Eastern Himalayas, North Bengal, for such a very, very long time. And the environmental sort of degradation that comes with it, the state violence that has been going on for so long in the name of, the land. And all of that, and it still continues. 10 years ago, how the rivers were when I studied in Darjeeling, in Kalimpong, and I think about when I was there and how it is now. They're building a, goddamn railway, in the mountains. They're boring the hills into Sikkim and making like a railway. And it's insane because like there's so much to be learned from all of the things that are happening, in the like it's just, and it's basically more and more getting worse. And this book was kind of beginning to look at home in a different way, in history's the heavy breath in that way, and to kind of taking stock of everything that happened. I think the book that I'm writing right now will probably be more sort of cognizant of that whole fact. I'm kind of trying to write through the history of the tea plantation legacy itself. I have found this really, really interesting book, for example. It's a book published by Siegel. It's basically a book of journal drawings by Somnath Hore. Have you heard of him? He has this book called The Tea Garden Journal. So I'm really trying to work through some of these histories through different places. For example, Somnath Hore was, sent by the Communist Party to cover the trade union strikes in the 1930s. And it's fantastic because he comes, he journals the entire movement through drawings and little, jotting down of what was happening at that point in time. And they are so immediate. They're almost lyric, they're a great source of these little bursts of lyric interventions on the farm. And and really, there's really a kind of a mine of history that is so buried, where I live. And I couldn't just like sort of look away in that sense. And in the second book, I'm trying to just get at it from different angles, but I'm not really getting to it. I'm really working with familial history and post-memory and secondhand accounts. But this whole idea of migrant, labor and the consequences of that is so huge. I think of my grandfather, who was brought as a migrant labor to work in these tea plantation. He didn't end up working at the tea plantations because he left after a month or so, but that legacy of that is so huge in that way. So I'm kind of in my new book that I'm writing, which is also part of my creative dissertation here. I'm trying to trace that history of sort of migrant labor and its consequences in the present, in my own migration to the cities in India first, as a migrant labor in that way, right? And my subsequent sort of immigration to the United States, all of that. So yeah, I think the second book begins an important point for me, and I had to begin from the beginning. It's almost a pre-colonial beginning. That part is the times that I'm writing about is almost a time where it was left to its own device. That particular area was left to its own device, and the Britishers did not care about that land for so long. It was seen as a corridor towards Bhutan and Tibet, and they just found it so difficult to speak to the Bhutanese king that they just left it alone for a long time. They tried, and they just couldn't get a conversation going. So in accounts of explorers like Young Husband and Ralph Fitch, for example, you get these accounts of where they just reach Kuch Bihar, and they call it like Cuch, Kuch Bihar. They reach there and they cannot really penetrate beyond the area where I live now, because that area is like no man's land, and there is sort of there's an extreme lack of communication beyond that. And later on, they start, making headway towards having communication. But this part of history of the land fascinates me, because it was a dead zone at a point in time, but also an extremely fertile zone in that way, because it was free from colonial influence in that way. It had indigenous populations living there and thriving.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that and I think that the voice certainly is not just a pre-colonial, but I'd say even a pre-modern voice. Where
Pre-modern, yeah, yeah.
It's like literally where we find that voice within certain literatures in the Indian subcontinent, but also all across the world before modernity.
Yeah,
and I think that the concept this was even present in your first book, but once again it came through the memory of your grandfather and a memory of your family. And it's not that memory is gone in the second collection. It's just that memory, a memory will be supplanted with, say, lines which are not just about the immediate personal. So for instance, I was thinking of this line, and this is a really great poem, Lamentation for a Failed Revolution. And you've done several things there. What I was struck by was not just the Greek sort of mourning structure, but also the use of Bengali letters, the Bengali script instead of the English script, but writing about, like, sort of putting in the forms of oppression through language, but also struggling against it and working with it. So English, the poems written in English, and the sections in the Bengali script, but also certain very interesting turns of self-introspection, not just for yourself, not just for the speaking voice, but for the entirety of the movement, because it is a failed revolution, but what is the purpose? And I feel like there are certain lines which cut through which are very brutal. So for instance, the seventh section, soon we understood what we were up against, an unfathomable hatred. They hated us just like they hated those others, like we hated those others, the butchers, the untouchables. And then you have ellipses, almost as a kind of loss of how to deal with this fact. Um, because prior to this, you have a very sort of moving elegiac line. So you say you will not name them,
Yeah.
in the fourth section. Well, technically not the section before, but the way it appears on the page.
Yeah.
These are the lines you will see. I will not name them. I want their deaths to be meaningless, full of rest.
Yeah.
And there's just like a jerking movement suddenly where you have a very almost unpoetic line, but also a very brutal truth revealed in a very brutal way. How and this poem really, I mean, it just takes so many registers and draws from so many things that and you indicate towards the ritual lament tradition in Greek, but I also think that it's a very situated poem for that particular place.
And thank you for saying that. It's actually definitely not pre-colonial as much as it is pre-modern, but I would also say it is pre-enlightenment in that way. So where it's kind of heading towards the register of the book itself is towards the Baroque. So it has that kind of enlightenment era sort of the wildness, the kind of because it's, as you can say, it's literally situated in, like, as I said, a no man's land. It's kind of begins from a kind of wildness that was unimaginable. Just because even if, people who were writing about that land couldn't enter it. Even people like Ralph Fitch, who were writing about their travels, early British explorers, all these people could not penetrate that area. So it was very much that kind of Baroque register is very much present throughout. And so much of this poem that you are talking about, Lamentation for a Failed Revolution, tries to get at that. Where can I sort of find a tradition old enough to kind of get at the register of something that I'm trying to write here, which is so brutal, and which is so contemporary yet so brutal and and ancient in that way. So I think the antiphonal structure really sort of gave me that space to work with the voices of women who have been so instrumental in the struggle for so long, and I needed that. I kind of needed that kind of structure, the antiphonal structure of the Greek lament tradition, to kind of have that in there, because that's how, as I said, it worked in ancient Greek. That was how the lamentation worked, where someone like Homer would sing the left part of it, and then there would be women who would read out the names and who would read out the lives of those dead there. And I wanted to subvert that in many ways. I wanted the women to be able to sort of the voice of the women to be able to tell the story of the revolution, because at the end of the day, the poet that is me is not really present there. I was present by accident. I had gone home for my summer break, and I just got trapped in there for 3 months when it was happening in 2017, right? So it was really looking at that idea of me writing about this. There are consequences to me writing about this revolution without really being a part of it, and I'm not marching, and all of that. Those things were going on in my head when I was writing these poems, and that is there, that kind of, I think, culpability, and that kind of that shame of almost a shame of survival, almost a shame of being safe in and being able to write these poems, within the academies of the first world. That was always sort of there for me. And it was like, I don't know, there were gaps, so I needed to work with those gaps that I didn't myself know about what was happening at that point in time. And those those ellipses, those caesuras gave me that space to speak not clearly about this, because there was no clear way of speaking about this violence, right? And the only clarity in that way becomes the antiphonal voice, which can sing about it, about their their own sort of role in the revolution. Yeah.
There's also an interesting link, not just between the politics of naming and not naming,
Yeah.
in a poem form, but also in a kind of journalistic register, which I think you're struggling with, not in a bad way. I mean, struggles aren't a bad thing.
Yeah, no, of
So
course.
in your website, you do name the martyrs,
Yeah.
in the notes to this poem.
Yeah.
And here it almost seems as if not naming them will give them the kind of rest that they deserve. Why is the not naming important?
I think to a great extent, Souradeep, I was trying to fight against this whole martyrdom. The whole idea is that these people were celebrated, their names were celebrated, they were, the thing is like, and that is so violent and vulgar to me in a way, because this links to the tradition of the Gorkha valor that people talk about. This people being, Nepali men have for centuries have been fodder for wars, fought elsewhere in the world, and that it links to that whole idea of the kind of masculinity, the idea of masculinity that has infused into the whole culture. I grew up in Darjeeling and Kalimpong, particularly Kalimpong, and I know what kind of the levels of ideas of masculinity that forms in a culture. And I grew up with that, within that space. And in so many ways, it is connected to that. I think at that point in time, I was trying to sort of sort of go against that within the poem, to not valorize them as martyrs, because these are deaths that were meaningless, that could have been easily avoided, easily not, I mean, easily, I don't know, made sense of in a way where where they didn't have to be killed. It was meaningless to an extent where we already had examples of this before, in the 80s, phase of the revolution, when it was the most bloodiest. So the thing is like, this was a kind of a reiteration of that. And there was there's great regret and sadness to something that happens again after we think that the lessons of history have been learned, and then it is sort of repeated again. And it was just that, I think. And I was really trying to push against the valor, the idea of martyrdom.
Oh, thanks for that. That's actually something that I couldn't really think that that's what you're trying to arrive at.
Yeah.
I'll come to a question about your grandfather, because he's almost like Hamlet's ghost.
Yeah.
Hamlet's father's ghost. I mean,
Yeah.
almost like a Shakespearean ghost for
Mm.
both the collections.
Yeah.
And there are some very interesting recurring images which come, but also a kind of critique of that masculinity. In another long poem where you're describing your mother waiting and your father getting drunk, and then sort of
Yeah.
the kind of, and you in the womb, almost like it's almost a strange point of view of you not being born and yet you aware of what's happening, and obviously you not aware as an unborn child, but aware through stories which have been told, perhaps in the family once you've grown up, or perhaps stories you've made up. But a recurring theme is one of masculinity and related to revolution. And I was wondering if you'd like to talk a little bit about you as a poet in Kalimpong, like, or not as a poet perhaps, but at least having some kind of like growing up within that atmosphere, but at some point deciding to be a poet, which isn't I mean, I don't know of traditions where men would perhaps lament,
Mm,
uh, because you are lamenting as the poet.
mm,
You are not the one who is martyred. You are the one
mm,
who is singing the song, which is a woman's job, so to say, in the
mm,
received tradition, perhaps.
yeah.
How do you place yourself and your sort of own growing up, and perhaps moving away even in that story?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll begin from my grandfather. Of course, I talked about how it's almost we talked about how the tradition the I think uh, the point where the book begins is almost pre-modern, as I said, pre-enlightenment. It also sort of moves from the first book in a way. The first book goes as far back as my grandfather. This book kind of goes beyond that. This book begins to see my grandfather within the labor, the tradition of people actually being brought there into this land that was, at that point in time. I talk about my grandfather, for example, clearing the lands, right, in the book, in this book, and kind of really uh, making that home there in a place where it was sort of full of, in farther, I talk about that entire long stretch of clearing the land and trying to sort of bring in the migrants there to live there. So it really goes to the story of how my grandfather sort of like got into that place, came into that place, was brought as a migrant laborer, and sort of goes beyond that in that way. And I think um, the issue of the masculinity is, I think we covered a little bit in the previous question. So it really is to do with the valor, the myth of valor, the myth of being a Gorkha soldier, that kind of thing. It seeps into every corner of the culture in that way. Um, and um, and I believe, that is where it comes and kind of seeps into the youth culture itself, a kind of culture that I grew up in, which was beautiful, which has elements of, like all other cultures. It has elements of great sort of camaraderie and um, friendship, but there was also this lingering readiness to violence that was so ever present. And for me, that was a source of sort of great anxiety, I think, growing up. You know what I'm saying? Like there is always this anxiety of this violence that can erupt anywhere, not just like social violence in the larger sense of the word. Particularly when I was living in Kalimpong, there wasn't actually, the Gorkhaland agitation had calmed down significantly during the period that I was living there. But there was always these political violences that were erupting. We would be walking in town, and someone would get shot, and then the whole town would be just like running, down the hill, and we would just like not know what had happened. And in the middle of Kalimpong, someone had been shot in broad daylight. Stuff like that happened all the time. So there was always this kind of lingering idea of violence, political violence, that was there, but also within ourselves too. There was gang violence happening. There was like violence, between boys, young boys, like beating each other up. It was like a lot of that kind of stuff that was going on beyond all of the other beautiful things that were happening. I think so that lineage of masculinity. Someone has written about that, the whole lineage of masculinity in my book, very interestingly in Eclectica, in an essay. But I think it is ever present, and I had to find ways when I became a poet. It took me a long time, to for my own education in that way, to 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 re-examine some of these things, to re-examine some of these ways that it has made me as a person. It has formed me as a person, and to be able to be aware and be kind of almost vigilant about it, as I work through the world as a full grown man, how some of the ways that the culture that has formed me, uh, kind of informs some of the decisions that I make. So it was interesting, and I'm kind of getting at that in this book in a way. There's definitely that idea of subverting. Particularly, it begins from the first book, as you said, with my grandfather and this kind of stoic disposition, uh, you know, of a man who was feared in town just because of the readiness to violence. As I said, he had a big position like an unnamed sort of position in the town, where he was like, and he was like the person where people would bring like thieves and people who had done stuff too just to be beaten up by him. So it's a legacy of that. But also, my grandfather was a man who was afraid of hospitals. There's this strange contradiction, like you cannot make sense of it. you know this man who is like feared by the entire town, and he just like is afraid of like hospitals, and that's what nearly became his came to how he died because of the way he neglected. So there is that tradition through the familial but also through the cultural, and then when you start looking at it in a larger sense, the whole the Gorkha soldiers, the whole tradition of valor is it's too much. And I think we need to start looking at it critically. We need to start looking at it much more critically, in a way to heal as an entire like generations of men, Nepali men in that way. So I think the work is still happening very slowly, and I think in my book I cannot avoid that particular issue. I think, but I come at it not in very pointed ways. I come at it in different ways. I think, yeah.
I think there's a lot of love and candor for this old man as well.
Yeah.
He comes as an old man. He doesn't really come as this person who can beat up goons professionally. He comes up he comes up as a, like, I couldn't have, if you had not told me, I couldn't have gotten that from the poems. I'm also thinking, sorry.
Yeah, no, there is a particular poem in the first book where my grandmother is just like, is like watching from the door and just like thinking, and this is a real story my grandmother told me. She had just gotten married, and someone brought this man who had beaten his wife and to my grandfather, and he just like tied him up outside in a post outside the house and started beating him. And my grandmother was just like shocked, in the sense like, what is happening? So yeah, it was a strange, anyway. I wanted to sort of
I'm thinking of the other landscapes in the poem as well, and for this I'd like to talk a little bit about the Indian Railway Canticle. I think that this is a poem where, even though it's a sort of fairly standard form and there's the lyric, but I think the beauty of it really comes between the shift in registers of the very particular, very particularized description of the railway compartment you're traveling in, and the very generalized, epic-like, almost again pre-modern descriptions of the things you see from the window. So you say, I saw storms lash the rice fields, lightning bolts brighter than all the villages' light bulbs put together, the sun bearing down infernal since dawn, breathing fissures into the earth. So there's this epic line every time you move away from, you don't describe the interior of this thing, and the moment you shift to the actual train bogie, the descriptions are so particular, and I think that the shift really between the lyric and the epic happens so well here, that poem gets its form. And I felt like in this particular poem, there's a kind of almost a way of you figuring out how to deal with these two kinds of registers.
Yeah.
Am I correct there?
Definitely, there is a tension between the unknown sort of outside, because trains were fascinating to me. I when I lived in Bombay, when I began studying in Bombay, this was my primary sort of mode of transportation. At that point in time, and to be for like 2-3 days in a train gives you like a lot of time, right, to really register what's happening. We would always move through like the long stretch of UP Bihar, and the whole unknown sort of the kind of, I don't know, it was this beautiful unknown outside of the train itself, where you couldn't really get down, but you're past. There's a strange way that the train journey acclimatizes you, because you are so physically moving through that space, and now it has become more and more impossible, with flight, with air travel becoming so much more common in India. But at that point in time, air travel was, and I couldn't even think about traveling by air, to go to Bombay. So this whole idea of, it was fascinating to me what happened inside the train, the people you meet inside the train, the stories that you have. I've made friends, I've spoken to people. It was just this insane, this kind of thing. I think I write about it in a kind of nostalgic way, because I don't think I'll be able to travel this way anymore. The kind of naivety, the kind of fear that you would have that your things will get lost, clutching onto your bag and sort of going to sleep with like a few hundred rupees in your bag, sued by your mom in your pant pocket and stuff, like, that kind of thing. It was immensely sort of interesting to sort of go back to. And I think also the really, there's a very Chekhovian moment, that I really, I was very interested in, that whole idea of the one time outside the train. And there is the moment where the register begins to change. A young woman in a niqab and a ferret-faced infant on her hips. The sudden, change of the men in the compartment, and the way there was this, it was a beautiful thing when I think about it now. And I registered it when I was fairly young at that point in time, but I only understood it later. That kind of sadness of suddenly encountering, beauty within that space. There's a Chekhov story where something very similar happens, where they're traveling and they meet this really beautiful woman, and all of them become sad, inexplicably. You know what I'm saying? And this moment is where the entire the speed almost kind of like diffuses in a way. I kind of bring the grace enters like suddenly in this poem, from outside the window, and it colors everything after that in a way, right? So I really was trying to sort of, this wasn't immediate. Again, this was recollection, and it was again trying to find that pace, that kind of halting, that kind of jagged pace of the train. And I almost kept this poem out of the book for some reason, but then I decided that towards the last moment that I should have it, because it felt so out of place in some ways, but also, I mean, I'm kind of glad I put it in, I guess. But yeah.
So I'm glad that it's there, because I think it for me, what it did was it sort of brings the whole story of migration, as you were talking about.
Yeah.
Not just migration from other parts to Eastern Himalayas to make them work in tea plantations, but also the migration away from like smaller cities to bigger cities, and then even bigger cities, and then even more bigger cities where trains are fairly sanitized. I feel almost bad for poets who live here. I feel they just don't have material to work with if you're traveling in. I remember traveling from the Lake District back last summer, and I was shocked that I could be in London in just like, say, 3 hours, where I've literally, not even the Lake District, I had gone to Edinburgh, and from Edinburgh to London in just a matter of 3 hours. And I thought, what would this journey be if I were to take like a journey from the north of India to the south of
Yeah.
India? And
Yeah.
the amount of material I'll get
Yeah.
will last me 10 collections if I'm a great poet, that is. Whereas here, it's almost so. And once again, there's that thing with age that you can do it in your
Yeah.
younger days. Really, you can't
Yeah.
do it when you're when you're.
Yeah. Yeah. We will just like, I'm not, that's the thing. The sadness is also that when I was writing that I'm never going to take a 3-day, 2-night train from like, Alipurduar to Bombay, which is like the end of like, one comes from the end of like, the country and ends at like Bombay. That's like an entire cross country run, which I would never do again. It's just insane. And to be able to cross like 4 states, have the food in each of the state come into the train, and just like all of that, it's quite insane, to wake up in the morning. And it's also beautiful, like in the sense, it was really, really, really something.
Yeah. This is just to change the register of our conversation a little bit. This is a fairly sort of nerdy question I would have probably asked you, but just ask you now. What is? I mean, you have this strange recurring Marlowe grave that comes in your first book, where you actually quote the line from Marlowe's grave, and and also in this book where you don't really quote the line, but there's a reference to Marlowe's grave.
Yeah.
What is the story of that particular?
What is the story of Marlowe's grave? There is a bunch of an interesting story. I mean, I think it was within the context of a particular relationship that I had at one point in time that was important. Um, and that particular line is so haunting to me. And within the context of this poem, of course, the poem here is about, deals with suicide, and it kind of recurred back to me. So there are these very interesting recurrences that happen in my second book, not by choice, but it kind of draws a line from the first book, in a way which is kind of satisfying later on when you look at it, because of course, it's the same person who has become this person to write this book. So I mean, there's not really a very interesting story, but cut is the branch that that might have grown full straight. It's a haunting line to me. But in the first book, of course, it had that kind of connotation of being within like it was like a private it was like a private quote, or something that occurred within the confines of a relationship that was important to me at that point in time. But in the second book, I think it kind of came on its own, in the sense it just made sense. And there's a lot of those hidden lines in the second book. There's Pound there, there's Auden even there. There's a line-to-line sort of small quote by Auden in a book, in a poem, early on, I think in Sebastian. So there's a bunch of things that I've done. There's a little transformer there. All of these are, of course, in my notes that I have put up in the. But I love that idea of playing around, with various sort of traditions that way. Yeah.
In the first book, though, I think it happens differently because in the first book there's a kind of romantic reckoning of the fact that you're a poet.
Yeah.
Whereas in the second book, you know that you are a poet. You are in a like.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a sort of public persona to you once you get your book out, for instance, or if you're doing an MFA in poetry, like there's no hiding away from that fact. Whereas in the first book, there's a kind of reckoning to that figure of the poet. And I'm thinking of one of the earlier poems there, where you're describing the relationship between Keats and Shelley. And them at the age of 27 and you at 27. Sort of this romantic affiliation of that reckoning that I am suddenly at this age where they
Yeah,
were, and this is what they were doing, and this is my life now.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
how different is that sort of self reconcile reconciling as a younger poet to the sort of more
Mm,
maturer voice, where you're aware of that maturity in a
yeah.
way?
I mean, I cannot pull that off now. You know what I'm saying? It had to be within the space of a first book. So that's why sometimes the first book has to come at the age, right? Because I couldn't pull that off now. I mean, I wouldn't pull that off now. I would like, um, but yeah, it made sense within the space of that book, within the kind of raw, the rawness of everything in that book. It made sense to have that. And in the second book, of course, I've already moved rather far away from it. And in the third book, that I'm kind of working on right now, I'm going somewhere else. I'm even, I don't think there is much aspect of the subject. There is an aspect of reinstating of subjectivity to voices, to non-human voices, to the voices of the British explorers, to the tea planters and the migrant laborers. It's a very different project, right? I mean, I'm also thinking of, for example, finally reckoning with the Indian Anglophone poetic tradition, but also in a different way. I don't know how I have found a very harder time in my second book to tradition in that way, because I think that book was written primarily in the US. But in the third book, I'm sort of, for example, looking at this particular streak of surrealism that begins in the 60s in Missing Person. And Arvind is very consciously writing as as a, what's that poem, Song of a Good Surrealist. So there is that strain that begins, which does not really go on to become more sort of established. I think it just disappears, and I'm very interested in that. It doesn't, for example, work in the same way it works for the French surrealist poets, where, for César, although I can trace Missing Person back to César's return to my native land so strongly, there are elements of that all over the place, in that whole coming back to the country and reckoning with this, the failing socialism, all of that, and Cesar was also kind of doing that. So I'm interested in that, in the sense, and I'm interested right now in this project in extending that surrealism that began sometime in the 60s and disappeared. What happened to that? Where does it, I don't know. You did your thesis on Adil Jasawala. I don't know if you ever sort of came across that or you dealt with that.
Yeah, no, I think that sort of, there wasn't, I mean, that sort of movement towards a kind of conscious, or maybe not even conscious, maybe
Mm.
something that was important for its time, that kind of avant-garde
Yeah,
moment in Indian English. I think even the poets themselves kind of abandoned it in their
yeah,
own work,
yeah,
not in a bad way. I mean, they did
yeah,
excellent
yeah.
things afterwards, but yeah, I mean, Adil's there are some poems in Trying to Say Goodbye where that
Mm, yeah,
voice in the Missing Person comes back, but it's really Missing
mm,
Person is its own
yeah.
great
It's his own
moment
thing. Yeah, it's a.
in Indian English poetry, where uh, and also some of Arvind's yeah, that poem certainly, Songs for a Good Surrealist.
Yeah,
And th- do you
yeah.
think that, I mean, it's just out of curiosity, you also worked as an editor, and I mean, obviously not in a the conditions that you just described, of unpaid internships. It may not have been a very pleasurable time in terms of sort of life, material needs that one needs.
Mm,
But you did edit. I think you edited Adil's prose work, and you
yeah,
also, I think,
Dreams Horse from the Sky.
yeah, I dreamt, and which certainly had like a very surrealist. You chose the
Yeah,
surrealist
yeah.
title for a book in the Indian English market.
Mm.
I dreamt a horse fell from the sky,
Yeah, I
and I
think
think also
Adil,
Mina's
yeah,
work, right?
yeah,
Some of
Mina's work.
Mina. So, what was that time for you? Like, how do you think that time as an editor has worked for your writing?
Yeah, I mean, I when I started really working full time there, I wanted to publish poetry. I mean, at one point I thought I was going to make my living as an editor, but I couldn't take it. There was not much sort of growth happening as it is in publishing in India. And I kind of decided that, okay, let's try to publish some they called it, what did they call it? I think legacy titles. No, something they call it something where they publish these few literary poetry titles to kind of for like a kind of name of sorts, not in the way that HarperCollins is, or even Penguin, I think, is publishing it away. But I thought that, okay, if I can just bring in about 2-3 books a year of poetry, I think no one's gonna notice. So I even started a kind of imprint called Hachette Poetry Series, which sadly, after I left, hasn't really taken off anywhere. But while I was there, I started getting, I mean, Jaswinder Bolina was already there in the roster for some reason. One of the older editors had worked with her. And then I tried to work on getting Meena, and Adil Jasawala's book took a significant amount of archival research. That was the hardest. Actually, it took me the entirety of my working there to finish that book, because it was I had to cull that from and newspapers. I had to go meet Adil in Bombay, all of that, and it was very rewarding in that way, because at that point in time, his book, I mean, we didn't have any of his books. The only book was through Almost Island, and at that point in time, I really, really wanted to do that. I wanted to do both Arvind's collected poems and Adil's, but I spoke to Arvind about this, and then I think Penguin sort of got wind of it, and then the project came out through Penguin, and then I was working with Adil. I was already talking to Adil too then, so I started with Adil's work, and I think it was it was fascinating to bring that out. I think after my experience in Nether, working with Nether, for example, it really opened me up to this, right? But it was just the next logical step for me to work on this book, and it sort of, I don't know, talking to him, like figuring out, reading some of those things that were written, the kind of freedom that I don't imagine essays like that being written now, in dailies, Indian dailies. It's fascinating. I mean, I dreamt a horse from the sky. Of course, it has that surrealistic, touch, the playfulness, yeah, there's something there. I've really been trying to think about that, not just that kind of anti-imperialist, French Caribbean surrealist mode that I think Adil was somehow sort of channeling in some form, although he probably wouldn't say that in Missing Person, but also this playfulness, later on. Even other poets, like I started, for example, reading the fascinating new book that came out. I'm completely forgetting, I'm blanking out on the name. Um, Raya Pearl.
Yeah.
Srinivas Rayapal. There's some very interesting language happening even in his earlier poems. This kind of strange. There's a strangeness. There's this kind of bright strangeness to his works. I think the person who introduces him talks about this, the difficulty of language itself working in his favor to make these poems strange and surrealist. But I I don't think that is the case, as much as, like, I think he's working on a very different register in his earlier poems too. So yeah, I'm kind of thinking of that, and in my own work, I'm trying to think of extending that lineage. If I'm writing towards any tradition at this point in time, I'm very consciously thinking about writing towards that tradition and thinking through that. So
I'm
yeah.
thinking, I think that also because they kind of, the early years happened outside of any regulation, that
Yeah.
I feel like even Indian journalism, English journalism was trying to figure out what it was trying to do. So you could just
Mm.
somehow write
Yeah.
an essay, or
You're
the kind of have a kind of irreverence towards tradition, because some of those essays in some of Adil's essays, for instance, when he describes T.S. Eliot, it's not the great major English poet, but Eliot in a bad mood in an English pub, which is which is a very sort of I mean having lived in London now for more than 2 years, I feel like that's a very normal occurrence to find.
Very accurate representation, probably. You know, it's I think it's also before these modernists and these entered the canon of the university syllabuses and everything, and which obviously sort of wrecks everything, because you're like, oh, proof rock, you know, and then you're done. You know, once you've memorized, you know, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, it's just like, it just, I think, I think it was very interesting because, that tone, you know, that tone of coming to India and trying to all at the same time figure out how to find this language to write about this place, and how to also take stock of the 10 years of sort of being there, or that tradition of English poetry. You know, I think it's very, very interesting.
Obviously, for a lot of that generation, I feel coming back was an important element, whereas for a lot of us, like our generation, and a lot of us, obviously not everyone has the privilege of going away, but a lot of the poems do happen in, I mean, it's a different world order. It's a different world completely. There is no sort of actually existing socialism the way it existed then. There is no, like, it's a different world altogether. No, but I'm asking, how is it like to stay in the American poetry model, and trying to work through these I mean, because it's a new experience, not just for you, but for, I think, a tradition of writing for Indian English poets.
I think particularly my whole way of looking at it is it's good. Even if poets who are writing, there are poets who are writing from India, for example, now, who sound like poets writing here, for example. The influence is so heavy. The poetry culture of America is so, it's almost scary, like, you know, in the sense, like, it is very pervasive. There are these phrasal, for example, you know, tics that I find in poems being written anywhere, you know, which is a symptom of the kind of dissemination that happens now, you know, the kind of poems that are being celebrated. I think for me, the most important thing was to recognize this and to rework this. This is the debris of the MFA industrial complex, you know. So I have to work through this. I have to work through other traditions. I have to work through Nepali poetry, especially because I am translating now. You know, there's so much of that I am dealing with, I'm working through. So I think it becomes a kind of, as I say, you know, a kind of ragtag vessel of, and I think this is the only way to be a poet at this point in time. You know, it's very seductive. The American tradition, the current American contemporary poetry scene is very seductive because it literally rewards you for writing certain kinds of poems. It rewards you for identifiable markers of tonality. You have to be so very careful, and you have to also, like, kind of understand, recognize that, and then you have to be doing your own thing in a way, because it ultimately, you know, gets lost. And so much of this is, I think, your own journey, and you kind of begin to, I think I played with, you know, I got stuck in it for a very little small space of time between my first book and second book, and then in my second book I already sort of get lost in that for a while, but I, you know, move out of it, and try to do other things, try to allow influences to be, you know, to be varied, I think, particularly on an equitable footing. There was a time, for example, when we were publishing Nether, we were reading a lot of American poetry. So the base became American poetry for a while. Um, so that I don't know what that did for us. I think for that generation of poets that we were, at least at that point in time, writing out of. But right now, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to find more subversive currents even within American poetry. There are translations that are coming out. There are more varied instances of interesting things sort of happening all the time here too.
I felt in your collection you kind of reckon with that a little bit, but almost I didn't know how to take this line, for instance,
Mm,
in the first
mm,
section of
mm,
recrimination fugue, where you
mm.
say, like the man who lived in a weeping fig tree after the bombings, I had been irresponsible with metaphor.
Yeah.
It's almost a I don't know if I have to take you seriously there, or
Mm,
if you're just saying
mm,
that precisely because I was irresponsible with metaphor that some of the poems turned out the way they were, and I'm glad that I was irresponsible with metaphor.
yeah, I mean, I don't know. That image came from, of course, a real war image. From Syria, I think, and it was not in the same way, but it just kind of weirdly, again, I'm already moving towards the mode of juxtaposition, the mode of sort of curiously jamming images which do not very a surrealist proposition in that way. I'm moving towards that already in this last section, where I'm trying to write about a very particular kind of grief, which is but through ways in which, at most points in recrimination fugue, is just like sound. It's just the grief is just trying to sound itself out, if there is that grief. So really moving in and out of sense was what I wanted to do in this poem. So there's a lot of like aleatoric images that come in accidentally, like being jammed. So yeah, particularly there, I don't know if there is a way to take all of it seriously. You know what I'm saying? Um, um, that's why it's a very different. I mean, it's a very jarring kind of experience to be beginning from, say, King's Feedery or reading Sebastian, and then sort of be reading these poems towards the end, because something else is at play. I'm a different poet by that time, and I wanted that movement to be evident within the book itself, rather than one book to another book. I wanted the book itself to become a record of someone moving somewhere, giving that kind of aspect of that journey, because I the restlessness was kind of already evident there for me.
Sorry, I think thanks for that. I think we've had a really interesting conversation. I'm a little tired, to be honest.
Yeah, I know.
Not
I think
in a physical way, but just my mind.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I'm very interested. We never got a chance to talk about your own thing, but you're moving into theater. You're producing. How's that performance? I'm fascinated by performance in that way. Like there is something else. There's a quantum leap in the expressive, expressive sort of mode, from writing to performing. You've always worked with that,
Yeah,
how does
I
this, yeah.
think I was I think I was always a sort of fairly reluctant poet, in the sense that
Mm,
I never. I think in the early years, maybe sort of started writing poetry precisely because the circumstances within which I could perform were taken
mm,
away. Once
mm,
again, because of bereavement, like a
mm,
sudden sort of
mm,
change, and Delhi once again didn't really. I mean, I mean, even though we are from the same state, and we'll
mm,
have, like, our people might have differences with each other, I think we can all unite in saying Delhi is its own thing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I couldn't quite understand its language. And performance is something where you have to sort of enter with your body, your voice, your everything. But coming here, actually in London, I live in East London, and here I discovered. I mean, Whitechapel is so it doesn't feel like it's anywhere else, but I'm back home again, and and I think that that discovery, but also like having a kind of studio where I can work in, um, just sort of triggered certain things in writing, and yeah, I think
That's great.
yeah, I'll be. We did like a work in progress thing, and I'm writing the third part. And once again, my influences are very similar to some of the research you're doing now. Not Shumnath Hore, but Chitta Prasad and the kind of I'm taking quite a bit of the visual language that they were trying to bring in the 40s, which I think is a precursor also to the modernism we saw in the 60s. I think Adil sort of draws quite seriously from that. I don't think Arvind or Kolatkar takes so much from that, but I think, but and also like this is also why I've been more fascinated with Adil, because I feel he sort of is just more aware of traditions. I feel more in his writing, and has also a very wide range
Yeah,
in style.
yeah,
So yeah, I hope to bring it to I hope to, because it's also the 80th yeah anniversary. So anyway, I think
yeah,
we should.
yeah. It was a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, so I think we should probably we've
Yeah,
well past our time, and
it was wonderful talking to you. So, it was. I think it was fascinating to talk about it. I wish we had more time to, but we will catch up at some point, and I would
yeah,
love to. I want to hear more about, what's happening,
yeah,
your change of medium, and how do you sort of work with that. Performance is, a fascinating thing in itself. Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you for
Should
asking
we?
all these wonderful questions. Yeah.
No, thanks. I loved talking to you, and loved reading and getting back to your work. Also, really look forward to reading Slow Startle again after having read this uh, uh, read this book. But also look forward to the next one that you're writing.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah. So
Um,
should we? Are we waiting for like somebody from
we
Rohan
end
to
it.
come in, or should
Stop this.
we?
I don't know. Should we tell them to end it, or how do we end this? I really don't know how to end this.
No, I haven't
Okay.
used StreamYard before, so maybe we should just say leave.
Yeah,
Like, should we just leave?
yeah. Just leave, I guess.
Okay.
And just hope they have recorded it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
See you.
Lovely talking to you, Rohan.